Howdy, everyone. You know where you are. You know who I am. Um, if you've been in the wrong place this whole time, feel free to stick along for the ride. Okay, so for the stages of U.S. foreign policy we went over, last module was all before World War II, leading up to World War II. So to go over very quickly, it's forming the U.S. that's entirely led by Congress, the Second Continental Congress, and there's no president at this point. Washington, the first president, even sets the two-term precedent. And it's not really a law yet. People think it's a law, but it's not a law till later. And then we have the expanding the United States, so President and Congress working together. Mostly, the Monroe Doctrine is a major deviation from this because it's Monroe acting on his own without the approval of Congress. It's a policy decision. And that's the first crack in what eventually goes on to be this big sort of spiderweb glass crack of presidential power in the future. And so from that we have the isolation of the US. Monroe Doctrine pushes Europe out, and then the Americas are doing their own thing. So there's a big focus on domestic issues like the Civil War, the Native American genocide, but that's all providing cover for less European power in the Americas. So it talks about Simon Bolivar or Simon Bolivar if you're uncultured like me. And the US is more or less dragged into World War One, and it doesn't really play that much of a role. But it's foundational to the League of Nations, but does not join due to limits on presidential power. That's where we talked about Woodrow Wilson, his stroke, Edith Wilson, and trying to push that all through Congress. It's just not able to really manifest the way people wanted it to, or at least Wilson wanted it to. And we have the fault lines for what we were supposed to go over today, which is World War II, or what I think of as World War One Part Two, because as we discussed with Weimar Germany, it's just the Treaty of Paris 1919 is just so terrible that it causes World War II. And the Cold War, meaning Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, 9/11 and the global war on terror, we don't actually have time to get into today, so we'll get into that next class. This includes the invasion of Iraq and the populist wave and decoupling. We'll get into that next week also. So you can tell a lot about a person by how they feel about FDR. What you can't really deny is that it's one of the most, if not the most, significant expansions of presidential power. Most obvious is that he's elected 4 times, breaking Washington's two-term precedent. Additionally, he oversees the United States through the Great Depression and most of World War II until the very end, where he passes away. The thing that always stuck with me from my high school history teacher was that very few people are 100% good or 100% evil. For every Hitler and Stalin on the evil side, you have on the good side a Harriet Tubman or Mr. Rogers. So on the and FDR is no exception to this. So he's very controversial because he did a lot because he was elected 4 times, which is part of the issue for some people. But on the pro side, you have the New Deal, bringing the USA from Great Depression through government spending. So there's no jobs. What's he going to do? Well, they're going to get jobs working for the government. And like, hey, everybody working for the government, doesn't that sound kind of like socialism? Yes. In fact, FDR would even agree with that to an extent. He said it was the little socialism to prevent the big socialism. Regardless of how you feel about economic theory or politics, that was a great term he used to sell this idea to the right wing. And then we have him turning it into a wartime economy in time for World War II. So not only getting people back to work, but having it so that people are able to build heavy industrial stuff. What people don't realize about World War II is German engineering was far more sophisticated than American on a per unit basis, but their per units were very low. So having it so America could produce a lot of high quality stuff turned out to be better than the Germans producing way less stuff of way higher quality. Great example being the tanks. A Tiger tank, one German Tiger tank could very reliably take out 4 American Sherman tanks, but so much engineering went into the Tiger tanks. So it's this idea that quantity has a quality of its own. And of course, the Soviets took this to be way too far, where they still sort of the Russian hangover of that you see in Ukraine, where it's just throw as many bodies at the problem as possible and hope it goes away. Furthermore, you have the Wagner Act and the work reforms, so stuff like minimum wage, fair labor standards and practices. Closely related to that, modernization of much of the USA. So what we think of as like modern highways and infrastructure especially. And there's this sort of alphabet soup of regulatory agencies. If you're from East Tennessee, you're probably very familiar with the TVA. Not a coincidence that its expansion was under FDR. But you can't have the sun without the shade. And there's some cons to his presidency too. He tried to pack the Supreme Court when he didn't get his way. If you're not familiar with this idea, court packing is based off this idea that there's no hard and fast rule that says the Supreme Court is limited to 9 justices. So if you don't like the way it's going and you are president and you have control of Congress and can confirm people, you just keep adding Supreme Court justices until you have a majority. But then what that would eventually turn to, if anyone ever did that, was people just keep adding Supreme Court justices until the Supreme Court's like 1 billion people. So him even trying to do this is seen as a stain on his legacy. He ignored a lot of the, sorry, I have a cold. He ignored a lot of the black and domestic worker community when creating work reforms. Most notably, a lot of the minimum wage laws just didn't apply to heavily black jobs. He created redlining when he made the Fair Housing Act. We don't have enough time to go into redlining, but it's what has done a ton of all the stuff that's not really talked about in school. It's probably what's done the most to extend black poverty. And of course, what everyone knows is he put either 110 or 120,000 Japanese Americans in internment camps. And that's no right to a trial, no right to a lawyer, no right to an appeal. They're put into these camps where many of them died only because their parents were born in the wrong country. And to a lot of people, he overstayed his welcome with 4 terms. However, he didn't finish 4 terms. He died in his presidency, and Woodrow Wilson took over. And if you look at the date on that newspaper, that's April 13th, 1945, which is just a few days before Hitler himself died, and leading to what's VE Day, or Victory Over Europe, but not VJ Day or Victory Over Japan. So much of Truman in his presidency is overlooking the defeat of Japan. Truman has kind of a weird legacy. He's known, I think, mostly for ending World War II and continuing FDR's torch, but it's a 4-term torch. And of course, Truman wins election on his own merit and all that. But the other thing he's kind of known for is being a bit of a nerd. And in classic Truman being a nerd fashion, he has the choice between going with these like two guys I've never really heard of, one named Einstein, one named Oppenheimer, who have this idea of building this like super advanced bomb called an atomic bomb or a nuclear bomb and dropping them on Japan. Or the other option that Truman has is sending in Chuck Norris, the karate guy. If you look at his birthday here, you can see that Chuck Norris was born in 1940, so he is about 5 years old at the time. But it's Chuck Norris. That's him fighting Bruce Lee. And for those of you who don't know who Chuck Norris is, he's famous for being bit by a snake. And then after 3 long, painful days, the snake died. Another time, Chuck Norris threw a grenade. It killed 10 men, and then the grenade exploded. And now Chuck Norris lives somewhere out west, and he's got this big bearskin rug. The bear's not dead, it's just afraid to move because it's in Chuck Norris's house. But like I said, Truman is a nerd, so he decides to send in Einstein and Oppenheimer and try their nuclear bombs as an attempt to end World War II instead of sending in karate legend Chuck Norris. I'm not going to post pictures of what the aftermath of the atomic bombs looks like. You can find that on your own. But Japan surrenders, VJ Day, there's the picture of questionable consent of the sailor kissing the nurse. World War II ends and the Cold War is kicked off. And the United States has three main approaches for its foreign policy in the Cold War. That's limiting nuclear weapons in communist countries, limit communist influence in the world, and then subvert the Soviet Union until it collapses. So we're going to go into those as the three main sections for the rest of this. Having used nuclear weapons, it seems kind of hypocritical for the United States to get mad about its ally at the time, at least, the Soviet Union having nuclear weapons. People can understand not allowing Germany, which had a nuclear weapons program also, but people can understand Germany not being allowed to have nuclear weapons. It's a tougher sell with the Soviet Union, though, because, I mean, we're friends, aren't we? I mean, we're not, but we at least have to pretend to be. Furthermore, America is finally dragged out of its isolationism, or at least its focus on just the Americas, into being what we think of as the world police now. What we talked about last week, the whole Team America world police. Because America tried being isolationist and it got dragged into World War II, so it's focused on taking a leadership role now. So America has two main goals right now, right? Stopping the Soviet Union from being too powerful and intervening in world affairs. So it doesn't want the Soviets to get nuclear weapons, VE Day, May 1945. The Soviets get nuclear secrets June, so a month later, 1945. How did this happen? And then the first successful Soviet nuclear bomb test is done by 1949. This is a controversial part of, especially the Cold War, is Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They're accused of selling nuclear secrets to the Soviets, allowing the Soviet nuclear program to advance as rapidly as it did, and they are put to death for it. Now, when we think of people being executed for crimes, I don't think nowadays anyone's executed for anything other than murder. And even then, it's egregious murders and special states that allow it, or at least more lenient to it. But Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are executed for treason. And we have to present both sides of this. Is there's still a sizable amount of people who argue that they were framed for it, or that they were unfairly prosecuted because they were Jewish. I have no opinion on that. It's just the way the facts are presented throughout the sort of narrative of U.S. history is that if they didn't do it, they're at least the fall people who are blamed for the Soviet Union advancing its nuclear weapons so rapidly. I really want to hammer home that they were executed for treason. And yes, treason is a capital offense. Like I said, it's not one you hear much anymore. So sort of a quick aside is that when politicians accuse people of treason, this is actually way more of a serious claim than people think it is. It's like accusing someone of murder because both of them are capital offenses. So people who have been accused of treason, Edward Snowden, if you don't know who he is, you can look it up on your own time. Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Tulsi Gabbard, Hillary Clinton. Smart people don't throw away or throw around the accusation of treason. It's very, very serious. So don't do it, I guess. And the Cold War really kicks off around this time. And so you have in the dark blue, the countries are NATO. One that's about to be super relevant is Turkey. Uh, and then in the dark red, you have the Warsaw Pact. And then with NATO, the first thing you'll probably notice is that it's more dispersed than the Warsaw Pact. We're seeing allies of the United States, those little pockets of red, especially in South America. We'll get to that. But Warsaw Pact, I don't think there's any Warsaw Pact countries that aren't contiguous to, if not the Soviet Union, then other Warsaw Pact countries. Especially right after World War II, so 1949, you have NATO mainly being the United States and most of Western and Southern Europe. So NATO itself, meaning the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I don't know if they'd identify this way because there's so much history in this area that I'm just not super familiar with. But with the Warsaw Pact, it's the Soviet Union and a lot of what we think of as Eastern Europe. And we wouldn't say Slavic because Yugoslavia is not 100% in there. And there's all these different ethnic groups with dissent in it also. So it's very difficult to determine in terms of nationality. In terms of statehood, though, it's obviously just a list of who is in the Warsaw Pact. And this whole U.S. foreign policy strategy of limiting communist influence abroad falls apart pretty quickly, or at least it suffers a major defeat pretty quickly with the ascension of communist Cuba. Not only is this a state quickly becoming communist, not even Marxist, but full-blown communist in the Americas, but it's very, very close to the United States. So there's Fidel Castro rising to power, and sort of the face of the revolution is Che Guevara. This isn't that long after World War II. This is in 1959. It takes a few years to consolidate power, but effectively the communists are in control in 1959. There's an attack on them under JFK called the Bay of Pigs invasion. It's not American forces, it's Cuban dissidents who are looking to come take it back over. JFK famously calls off air support to support the invasion, and the people, the Cubans looking to reinvade Cuba, are slaughtered on the beach like pigs, so the Bay of Pigs. But Castro is able to hang on to power from essentially 59 until 2008. Y'all say that again, 59 until 2008, which is a hell of a run. And he steps down, his brother Raul comes to power, Raul steps down, Fidel himself passes away in 2016. There's a right-wing conspiracy theory that Fidel Castro is Justin Trudeau's father. This is because the Cuban government, especially Castro, are very friendly with the Canadians. And this photo is actually Fidel Castro with young baby Justin Trudeau. People say they look a lot alike. I can sort of see it until you look at Justin Trudeau's father and you think, oh, he looks more like his dad. But you're probably wondering, well, who even is this Justin Trudeau guy? I think he's mostly famous nowadays for being Katy Perry's boyfriend, but he was also the Prime Minister of Canada for a very long time. Now, Cuba really starts to become a problem, sort of the US's own doing, with these things called Jupiter 2 missiles. The United States decides to put them in Turkey, which is a NATO member. So, like I said, Turkey's a NATO member, and it's very, very close to Moscow, at least relative to most of the world. So the missiles are able to shoot into Moscow very quickly, sort of throws off the balance of power. The NATO West, whatever you want to call it, has this advantage that the Soviet Union declares to be unfair. So what do they do in response? Well, they have this new communist ally in the Americas. So the Soviets decide to send SS-4 missiles into Cuba. So it's within relatively the same striking distance as Washington, D.C. So there's this massive Soviet military buildup in Cuba, sending all these missiles, at least planned to. And yeah, you can see just above it is the tip of Florida. That's how close Cuba is. And for everyone who's sort of mad at JFK for calling off the air support during the Bay of Pigs invasion, well, you have this sort of blockade for the Cuban Missile Crisis that it's up to you if that redeems him from it or not. But a lot of people would say it balances it out. But there's this blockade to stop the missiles from going in. And it's what launches off what we call the Cuban Missile Crisis. And when I said launches off, that was no pun intended, but there you go. I don't know if y'all are very familiar with how the game Chicken goes with cars. I think people know the game Chicken in pools where people get on each other's shoulders. But with cars, it's two cars drive at each other as fast as they can. And the first person to move away is the chicken. Of course, if neither of them move away, then they crash into each other. But this is essentially what's going on at the Cuban Missile Crisis. Two navies are looking at each other, telling each other to stand down, and if they crash, then nuclear bombs are going to be flying through the air. Soviet Union backs down, and the Cuban Missile Crisis ends with an American victory. And it's not sort of a bad metaphor for how the whole Cold War goes, or you could almost think of it as a Mexican standoff. Um, Nobody wants to take the first shot, and it's all about de-escalation, or how do you go from both superpowers pointing nuclear weapons at each other to eventually dismantling. And well, we can get into that through diplomacy and policy. So next time you're at the club and people start talking smack about U.S. foreign policy and the importance of diplomacy, hit them with these facts and you can show them up in front of everybody. First one is the limit to nuclear weapons being the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's in '68. It's essentially an agreement that they're not going to, or at least they're going to try to prevent states who don't have nuclear weapons to continue to not have nuclear weapons. Of course, it doesn't work. Plenty of other states get nuclear weapons after this, most notably North Korea. But it's this attempt to limit that. Then there's the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT. There's actually two parts. SALT 1, which passes, SALT 2, which almost passes. But it's basically this push to have less deployable, less lethal nuclear weapons. So not only they're trying to keep with NPT, they're not trying to keep it from spreading, they're also trying to have it be less lethal. There's the INF, or Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, in 87. Kind of a jump, almost 10 years, but the idea is to have nuclear weapons at least a certain distance from each other. Doesn't make a huge difference, but it makes people freak out less. So substantively, not a huge deal. Symbolically, a gigantic deal. And there's the START 1. That's in 91. Soviet Union agrees to deep cuts in its spending. And then finally, 91, Soviet Union collapses, of course. There's the Nunn-Lugar program, like I said, also in 91, and it's dismantling extant Soviet nuclear bombs. So Soviet Union's falling. There's going to be this treaty to make sure that none of the bombs end up in the wrong hands. And I know what you're thinking, of course. Paul, you not at all monotone, super funny guy. What about Ukraine having nuclear weapons? We talk about that a ton since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is where I have to put on my Reddit hat and say, well, actually, Ukraine never had nuclear weapons. As a deal for its independence, it had to give, technically, it had to give the Soviet Union back the weapons that the Soviet Union already owned. So it seems like a very pedantic thing, but it's actually super important when you talk about Ukrainian independence today. So if part one is limiting nuclear influence, part two is limiting communist influence in the world, or communism as an ideology at least. So the main theaters for this are Korea, and not North or South Korea, but the Korean Peninsula or historic Korea. Cuba, and to a larger extent Latin America, which there's really not enough time to go into as much detail as I'd like to there, but we'll brush on it. Vietnam, I think we all know what that is. The United States, which is not something people really think about, but it's super important. And Afghanistan, which, as we brushed on, very much complicates things in the 90s and 2000s. So some backstory on what's happening in Korea at the time is that from 1910 to 1945, Korea was actually occupied by the Japanese. And it's still a huge sticking point between South Korea and Japan now. North Korea, I can't speak for. I don't know what their stance is on much other than anti-everything that's not China. But like whenever we try to cooperate or have South Korea and Japan cooperate against China, this becomes a big sticking point of grievance between the two. And of course, Japanese occupation of Korea ends in 1945 because Japan had unconditional surrender after the nuclear bombs dropped. So the same way Germany was split among the Soviet and the rest of the Allied powers, the same way Berlin is split between the Soviets and the rest of the Allied powers, you have basically the same relationship with the Korean Peninsula. Because it's closer, North Korea is put under Soviet occupation, and South Korea primarily put under United States occupation, divided at the 38th parallel. Here's the thing most people miss about Korea is that Korea actually is one identity. To be Korean is to have one identity. So when the Soviets pull out, there's this effort to reunify Korea, but starts as a Northern Korean invasion of the South that's super successful. If you look at the map on the left, you can see that North Koreans took Seoul, the capital, and pushed the South Korean forces all the way to Busan or Pusan. If you've seen the zombie movie, that's the town they're going to, Train to Busan. Then in the 11th hour, UN forces led by the United States come in, hit the Korean Peninsula from two sides, and are able to push the North Koreans all the way back up to the mountain ranges that make the border between North Korea and China. Now, if there's two things North Korea and China both have in common is that they're both communist. and China doesn't take very kindly to this. So the same way South Korean forces are kind of being heavily carried by Allied powers, UN, um, United States, and all that, North Korea gets a massive assist from China. People's Liberation Army. China's just coming off its civil war that ended in 49. So they've got veterans, they've got experience, they have plenty of weapons, and they're looking to expand not only communism, but their influence in East Asia. So China comes in and helps North Korea push back. And for such a forgotten war, and we'll get to that in a second, people forget how close the Korean War was. Seoul, South Korea's capital, changed hands 4 times, and Pyongyang, North Korea's capital, changed hands twice. But eventually, China is able to push, and then there's sort of a major land grab, and then it's fought sort of in the trenches until they can come to the compromise of the 38th parallel. And so now Korea, or at least the Korean Peninsula, is divided among what's called the DMZ, which is around the 38th parallel, but it's demilitarized zone, the world's largest minefield, and it's sort of where everything's settled today. And of course, there's Chinese fingerprints on this too, right? So on the left you have, most Chinese people don't know this, but on the left you have Mao Anying, who is one of the sons of Mao Zedong, so chairman of China during this. He was actually killed during the Korean War. He left his tent to either cook or clean, I forgot what, and an American bomber dropped napalm on him. They had no idea who he was. To the bomber, he was just a Chinese officer, but he was burned to death with napalm. And then on the right, you have a movie that came out in 2022, a sequel, The Battle at Lake Changjin. I haven't seen it yet. I keep meaning to, but it's still within the Chinese consciousness now, at least is my point with this. I haven't seen it, but I have seen the trailer for it, and it is kind of funny how they make MacArthur, General MacArthur, to look like this boss level threat, which to the Chinese he technically was, but in America he's sort of remembered as a hero, with his hat he made himself and his aviator sunglasses and all that. So it is funny to think of him as a villain, and just sort of how perspectives work differently with people. And on the American side, there's also interesting stories. This is Lieutenant Kurt Chuan Lee. He's the first Asian American officer in the United States Marine Corps. And not only is he Asian American, but he's Chinese American. So you can see where this is going, I think. He's fighting against the Chinese in the Korean War. And this becomes a sticking point for a lot of the troops serving under him. He's subject to very racist comments, both to his face and behind his back. But when they actually hit combat, his men go for cover and he charges forward. And so he's against Chinese forces as a Chinese American. Now, before the Chinese are able to get a good look at him, he takes cover. They haven't really seen his face yet. And he shouts in fluent Mandarin, of course, because he speaks Chinese. He says, "Don't shoot at me, I'm Chinese." The gunfire from the Chinese stops, that giving him the opportunity to throw a bunch of grenades and order his men to charge forward and say, "I'm Chinese American." And they go on to win the battle. And I know it's not the war that really comes to most, especially Americans' mind, but there's the Korean War Memorial in DC, and it is worth visiting. It's these 19 soldiers going on patrol. They've got their raincoats on, and this just sort of miserable cold that defined the Korean War for a lot of people. But if you look on the left, you'll see this big reflective wall. And you can see, of course, reflections of the 19 soldiers. So 19 reflected, so that's 19 times 2 being 38, symbolizing the 38th parallel. If you're in DC, I highly recommend checking it out. But that's kind of where the war ends, is the ceasefire among the demilitarized zone, sort of built off the skeleton of the 38th parallel. And it's not only from a diplomacy standpoint, but a storytelling standpoint, which is how I try to communicate these things to y'all, is it doesn't really end with this big dramatic victory or defeat like what we see with VJ Day or the fall of Saigon. It just sort of ends. And at the same time, it doesn't even do that. We declare a ceasefire, we build up all this infrastructure along the border that you can see in this photo, but this is very Reddit, I know, but technically the Korean War is still going on. And sort of this lack of a conclusion, I think, lack of closure, that can be very frustrating. Speaking of stuff that's gone on for way too long, let's jump into Cuba. So 59, you have the ascension of Castro, and he gets a heavy assist from Che Guevara, another revolutionary in Latin America. So communist power right on America's doorstep. And as you can probably guess, the other Latin American communist movements become a major concern for the United States, not only because of their proximity, but also because of the sort of hangover from the Monroe Doctrine and this shared identity being within the quote-unquote Americas. And so the major movements in list of severity are Cuba, of course, which not only became communist, has remained communist and was the impetus for the Cuban Missile Crisis, Bay of Pigs. It's a big issue within U.S. foreign policy today. We still have a trade embargo with Cuba. Nicaragua, Grenada, Venezuela, which got to be a hell of a lot more relevant recently. Colombia, which never actually became any version of Marxist, but there's a big asterisk on that. Argentina, Bolivia, and I would also add Chile if there was more room. But Bolivia is also important because it's where Che Guevara was executed. So within this phase of United States foreign policy, we have this pattern of the U.S. wants State X to hold free and fair elections. State X elects Marxist leadership. Marxist just means communist or socialist. And honestly, they don't even really need to elect the leadership. Just the leadership needs to be big enough to be a concern, often through Soviet influence. And then they either win a majority or a plurality enough to where the U.S. has to say it was rigged to try again. So you're free to choose whoever you want as long as you don't choose the wrong choice, which is not really what democracy is. One of the more visible groups, especially because their high amount of female militants, was the FARC, or the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, which was effectively fighting a guerrilla resistance from 1964 all the way until a peace deal in 2016. Furthermore, there was the resistance in Bolivia, eventually quelled, especially with the execution of Che Guevara. What was especially a big deal in the early aughts was Pinochet. Not because of what was going on, that had happened earlier during the Cold War, but his trial and eventual death. But in Chile, Augusto Pinochet was propped up by the United States because he was explicitly anti-communist.
And when I say anti-communist, I don't mean he just didn't like communism. As you can see on the right, he would load suspected communists into helicopters, fly dozens of miles out to sea, and then throw the communists out of the helicopter for them to drown, propped up by the United States. And in the odds, this became an especially big issue because he was on trial, and the group Amnesty International was a big driving force for all the debate around what to do with him. And Marxism in South America continued even beyond the Cold War with the ascension of Hugo Chavez and his heir apparent and eventual successor, Nicolas Maduro. Fun fact about Chavez, though, the same way Katy Perry has like 1 degree of separation from Fidel Castro, one of the UT professors has interviewed Chavez many times before his death, and she taught me, so I have 2 degrees, 1 degree from Hugo Chavez. And of course, Nicolas Maduro eventually came to power in Venezuela, which was an issue for the United States because Venezuela has some of the best oil reserves in the world. And some would say it's because of his totalitarian policies. Others would say it's because of his felony oil possession, sort of a satirical joke. But he was arrested, taken to the United States just a few weeks ago. So first off, I apologize for the weird noises in the background if you can hear them. My dog threw up and I'm running the washing machine. But democratic Marxism as a pattern. US wants state X to hold free and fair elections. State X elects Marxist leadership. US says it was rigged, try again. Despite that being such a definitive part of our policy toward Latin America, our meaning the US, it wasn't just limited to Latin America. A similar thing was going on with Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, especially North Vietnam after the French occupation ended, kicking off what would be eventually called the Vietnam War. Now, I've used this picture for the Vietnam War like 1 billion times, so let's move on to at least anything else. So I kind of prefer to use this because it's got the soldiers looking like they're actually assaulting the trees more than anything, and the big emphasis on helicopters, which came to define what a ton of the Vietnam War would be. But the same way democratically, quote unquote, democratically elected South Vietnam was being defended by the United States, really propped up by it. North Vietnam was heavily propped up by the Soviet Union, so effectively a proxy war, except the United States was directly involved. So for basically all the wars we've talked about to this point, except maybe Korea, the draft was sort of compulsory within United States national politics. It was a foregone conclusion that people would be drafted to World War II, for example. My own grandfather, same name as me, ended up joining the Navy because he didn't want to be drafted into the Army. But what was so different about Vietnam is there was a draft. It was almost compulsory at this point. There's a war, you're going to have a draft. People didn't really know what they were being drafted for. And it caused a ton of antipathy toward the cause. So this really resulted in 2 things. On the left, you see this picture, probably the most sanitized picture I can find of Vietnamese or Vietnam war crimes. So you have people within Vietnam, soldiers who do not want to be there and are taking out this aggression on the local populace. And on the right, you have anti-Vietnam War protests, even domestically within the United States. And we'll get to this in a second. It actually led to the rise of communist movements in the United States. Now, war is always more popular when it's successful. And so people were kind of ambivalent. They didn't know how to feel about the Vietnam War until the Tet Offensive. Tet is the Vietnamese New Year, sort of a Lunar New Year. And all the American forces expected the Vietnamese to be celebrating, off getting drunk with their families, kind of like Christmas for the United States. Where in fact the Vietnamese had suspected the Americans to think that and used that as an excuse to attack even harder. And they made this huge offensive during the Tet holiday. Because of that, the press or the strategists, or however you look at it, really saw this as the turning point for Vietnam, especially winning the war. People willing to give up the holidays effectively and their lives so they could more effectively fight people who didn't want to be there. There's even this term within celebrity culture called radical chic, sort of popularized by the author Thomas Wolfe, but to where chic meaning fashionable, it even became fashionable to be a radical, especially left-wing extremist. Sort of one of the forerunners for this was Jane Fonda, who, while America was actively at war with Vietnam, or North Vietnam at the time, she went to go humanize, her words, humanize the North Vietnamese enemy, going on what was essentially a propaganda tour of North Vietnam. So here's her posing with an anti-aircraft gun with North Vietnamese soldiers. Wars are ultimately won or lost by conviction, and Vietnam just had more conviction than the United States, ending in the United States' first major loss in a war, the Vietnam War. So sort of one of the most iconic photos is this last chopper out of Saigon, or the last American chopper leaving Vietnam. And the unpopularity of the Vietnam War even continued on to the memorial in DC, where it's ultimately just a list, a very permanent list of names, not emphasizing any glory or anything greater than man, like one might see in the World War II memorial or the Korean War memorial. It's a list of names of people who died to remind people of the human cost. Now, I don't mean to keep dragging everything back to the 2008 election, but this was a wild election that people don't talk about enough, and weirdly enough, the Vietnam War was relevant. Sort of first and least important was when Sarah Palin was rapping the song Baby Got Back. That song explicitly references Jane Fonda, who had that presence of a radical chic during Vietnam. I can't quote it directly, but Sarah Palin was also up for vice president in 2008. Now, what's more relevant is the fact that 2008 was supposed to be, at least according to the Democrats, Hillary versus McCain. Hillary Clinton, senator from New York, versus John McCain, senator from Arizona, were the two big establishment figures running for president. Of course, Hillary eventually lost the Democratic nomination to Barack Obama, who would go on to win the presidency. But at the time, this was a very serious debate, was Hillary versus McCain. So during Martin Luther King Day of that year, Hillary was asked where she was when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And she had a honestly super touching story about how she was in college at the time. She threw her books down and cried. And then John McCain, who was older than Hillary, was asked the same question. And he looked dead-faced at the reporter and said, "I was a prisoner in Vietnam at the time. I didn't know he was killed until years later." Which brings me to talk about the communist movements within the United States. One of the most visible and I think most currently referenced today is the Black Panther movement. This has nothing, well, it's actually semi-related to the Marvel character Black Panther, but this was a group of African American or black men that felt solidarity with Marxism, among other things. I think on the other extreme of the Black Panther movement, which is generally seen as like a, at least on aggregate, positive push for Marxism with the United States, you have probably the most negative push for Marxism, which would be the Jonestown cult, which were a weird blend of Christian and Marxist. It eventually ended with around 1,000 of them committing mass ritual suicide in Guyana. But if you've ever heard the term drinking the Kool-Aid, it comes from the Jonestown cult. And then Marxism in the United States, you kind of have to talk about the Communist Party, which have been around long before the Vietnam War, really even the Cold War, and still exist in some form today. And then you go into sort of the most absurd and clownish, like the Symbionese Liberation Army, or the SLA, which kidnaps the woman on the right, Patty Hearst, the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, a big newspaper guy. Citizen Kane is based off him, the movie Citizen Kane. But she was eventually radicalized into becoming one of them through Stockholm Syndrome was her defense. But this group is honestly worth a lecture in itself for how clownish they were. And probably the most prolific of all the Marxist groups in the United States was the Weather Underground, also known as the Weathermen. On the left, you can see the actual members. The top left, you see Bernardine Dohrn. Middle right, you see Bill Ayers. These are both Ivy League professors now, believe it or not, since their radical days. And on the right, you can see that, yes, the movie One Battle After Another is actually based off the Weather Underground. So the group in this, the French 75, is based off the Weather Underground. But to stop this influence in the United States, in a very South America sense, or U.S. policy towards South America, you're free to choose whatever you want as long as you don't pick the wrong choice, which is a paradox, obviously. You have J. Edgar Hoover, for most of his career, subverting the domestic communist movements. Moving on from the containments within Korea, Latin America, the United States, Vietnam, we have a push of communism very explicitly into Afghanistan. This is often called Soviet Union's Vietnam, since it really didn't make sense to invade, like with Vietnam. The troops really didn't want to be there, and they underestimated the local guerrilla forces. So almost one for one, Vietnam just traded jungle for desert. And this kicked off what was later called Charlie Wilson's War, or Texas Congressman Charlie Wilson pushing for weapons to be sent to the Mujahideen. Because who's going to be more for sending weapons somewhere than a Texan, right? That's a joke. But the picture on the right is actually Charlie Wilson shooting a 50 cal machine gun. Later on, he was caught up in ethics investigations, sort of prompted by this. He was accused of doing cocaine with women of the night, women of ill repute. I don't know what the politically correct term is. His excuse was, and this isn't a direct quote, but when asked about cocaine use, he basically said, I either was or wasn't doing cocaine, but the strippers were. But the whole phenomenon of a guy who had done a lot to curb Soviet influence in Afghanistan, who really didn't have much stake in the matter at all, was adapted to a book, and then eventually a Tom Hanks movie, Charlie Wilson's War. Honestly, both of them are pretty good if you get a chance to check them out. And of course, this is what sets off the very weird American support friendship with the Mujahideen, which, as we'll talk about next module, really did not work out well for America super well. And then last, probably most successful, was just undermining the Soviet Union on its own turf. Limiting nuclear weapons, as we discussed in the first part, was a big concern. Limiting the spread of Marxism, socialism, communism, whatever you want to call the different flavors, was a big part. But actually undermining the Soviet Union itself secured victory for the West. And this is a very bold claim. To ask how the Cold War ended to any academic is like asking, why do good things happen to bad people? Why do bad things happen to good people? Like, it's such an abstract question, no one really knows how to answer it. Except for me, because I'm a genius. One is the USA had allies that wanted to join, and the Soviet Union made their allies join. Another big thing was the USA had a productive economy. The Soviet Union's economy struggled due to central planning. And finally, the ideology of communism / Marxism fell apart slowly. So I touched on this earlier, the sort of composition for the Allies within the Cold War, and for who's actually a member of the Warsaw Pact really just depended on your proximity towards the Soviet Union. And the central planning within the Soviet Union just didn't work out well. Central planning is this idea that the government controls production for everything instead of the market. But the thing is people manipulate government quotas really quickly. I mean, people are smart. So there's this joke from the Chernobyl TV show. What's as big as a house, burns 20 liters of fuel every hour, puts out a shitload of smoke and noise, and cuts an apple into 3 pieces. It's a Soviet machine that is made to cut an apple into 4 pieces. So ineffective, doesn't work, and just wildly too expensive. If you've ever had a class with me before, you've heard me talk about these lamps. The lamps within the Soviet Union, production was not measured by any sort of effective standard other than tonnage of lamps produced. So you heard that right, tonnage, how much they weigh. So if you're being measured by tonnage, you can honestly go make as many good effective lamps as you can, or because you're only measured on how much they weigh, you do what this picture shows and just make a lamp with an insanely heavy foot because you know you're being measured by weight and not anything else. So that's the lamp economy is not what killed the Soviet Union, but this whole ineffective way to measure productive output is effectively what killed it. And effectively, what happened to the Soviet Union over a long time was it stopped being cool. People lost the fervor. Cost-effective buildings sound great until you see how ugly they are. I mean, that's almost as bad as the buildings on UT's campus. Furthermore, you have the actual human rights abuses through the Gulag system. And then you have the gene revolution, or just super restrictive imports, just what people are allowed to experience, to where the same youth that really opposed the Bolsheviks eventually opposed the Soviets because it just became uncool. And then there's this like weird hypocrisy with the Soviet leaders. Not all of them are overweight, sure, but they all look well fed. Compared to a society where people are expected to not only share everything, but suffer in everything too. It's the suffering which was not equal. going back to this whole idea of the Soviets becoming uncool, but this very fringe countercultural revolution eventually just sort of became a way of life for people. And the sort of passion and everything that kept it driving on died off in just sort of a matter of course. And so, sort of like the Animal Farm metaphor I was talking about, the revolution wasn't able to really stay true to itself. This doesn't mean it wasn't real communism or was real communism. It's just the case of the Soviet Union. It just, people lost support of it. A new generation of young people came in and thought they could do better. And when you look at the iconography for the end of the Soviet Union, you see that it's like, yeah, blue jeans, rock music, and stuff like that, imports from the West, is people wanted to cooperate, which became a very big theme of what was to follow. International cooperation, globalism, the world is flat. People didn't want to be, or at least people thought they didn't want to be siphoned off into these individual groups anymore. I hear you asking, even though you haven't seen this yet. Paul, you super not monotone, super intelligent person, was the Cold War a victory for the United States or NATO? So then I would say, well, yes, but actually no. I mean, just because the Soviet Union fell doesn't mean there's not communism in the world anymore, right? So it's, what does the victory condition really look like? There are 5 communist countries left in the world. 4 of them are in Asia. One of them is very close to the United States, but is the communism there is hanging on by a thread, basically. Next module, we didn't have enough time to get into the war on terror, but we'll go into the sort of hangover of international cooperation that ended up winning the Cold War, into what too much of that or too little of that can look like within the war on terror. So I'm going to leave it there. We'll talk more about the presidential implications of all this too, and I wish you all a fantastic weekend.